The next session I'll be moderating looks at the importance of staying connected, which against the backdrop of 2020 and 2021 seems doubly weighty. We've all been physically apart so much over the last 2 years. And in terms of work, this is something that may continue, with more employers adopting long-term remote working environments. But at work, relationships with colleagues, as well as the role of friends and mentors, is a key contributor to well-being. Is this something that's achievable still in a post-COVID world? To explore all of this and more, I'd like to introduce Shivani Gopal and Kathryn Nicholson Perry. Shivani is the CEO and founder of The Remarkable Woman. Hello, Shivani.
Hello, Tarla. How are you? Great to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. Shivani's a passionate serial entrepreneur and a finance expert on a mission to create a more equal world. And we also are joined by Kathryn Nicholson Perry. Thanks so much for joining us, Kathryn.
Hi there, lovely to be here.
Kathryn is the Associate Dean at ACAP, the Australian College of Applied Psychology. She's also a professor in clinical psychology and a leader within the field of clinical health psychology. She has led major research into the links between psychology and pain. So I want to kickstart this conversation around the topic of being separated, which is something that we've all had to navigate over the last 2 years. But what are some of the ways that women's mental health has been impacted by our lack of human connection, or at least by this kind of very kind of different human connection that we've kind of grown accustomed to throughout this period? Kathryn, I might start with you on that one.
Sure. Well, I think, it's interesting that levels of loneliness and isolation in society were already at very high levels before the pandemic struck. And so, we've come into this situation in a backdrop of a lot of people feeling that they didn't have the kind of social connection that they were looking for. And of course, now it's really difficult to disentangle all of the different factors that might actually have contributed to the overall negative impact that the pandemic has had on mental health. I mean, I think it's also worth saying that, that certainly for many people that's been a negative thing, but for some of us, like myself, I'm quite an introvert. It in some ways has been a better match for some of us, where we've actually found that ability to be at a bit of a distance or be spending more time at home, etc., to be a beneficial thing, and it might suit some people better. I guess the other thing about it is then that unlocking, the great unlocking, and everybody kind of coming back out again. And I think, I certainly remember feeling myself the first time I kind of got onto public transport, and that kind of sense of anxiety and, just the shock almost of being back in public and with other people again.
Mm-hmm. And Shivani, some thoughts on your end on that?
Yeah, look, we're all such social creatures, and Kathryn, you made a great point around introverts, and I was just thinking about that because this has been a great mental health challenge from an isolation perspective, from a human connection perspective, primarily initially at least for the extroverts. I think about all the social gold, and I think about the people who really cherish and love to get out and meet their friends on a regular basis and love to bounce into work with a cup of coffee and good morning to everyone. There's been this great mourning, this great loss of this ongoing human connection and micro-socialization, which often happens because, you just run into someone in the elevator, you run into someone at the cafe, and then you have a fleeting conversation with someone in the kitchen, you're mixing sugar into your teas as you go to your desk. So those things, really waning have taken away these micro moments of joy, of connection, of conversation, of engagement, and as a result have waned on mental health. Whereas when I've spoken to a lot of my friends who identify as introverts, many of them have said, at least during the 2020 part of the pandemic, or the first half of the lockdown that just happened here in Sydney, was, hey, I'm really liking this. This is actually really working for me because I'm able to use my space in a way that works for me and tap into human connection when I want it, but also just really respect my introversion. So look, it's been really challenging from a mental health perspective in different ways. I think what's really important here is that people get really clear on who they are and how they need connection. If they need connection in a micro socialized manner, then it's then trying to find ways to bring that back into their lives, whether it be short walks, whether it be going to the cafe and just having a random chit chat to their barista, to help you feel more comfortable on a mental basis.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the ways that you feel employers can mitigate long-term impacts of this? And I guess I know, Shivani, you've pointed out that a lot of women have benefited, a lot of people have benefited from it as well. And I think, that move to remote work is really suiting a big cohort of us. But there are a lot of us, a lot of workers who are more extroverted and who probably are really kind of missing that dynamic in a face-to-face environment. So how do employers kind of work towards, I guess, supporting their teams through that? Kathryn, I might go to you there on that one.
Yeah,
the
sure.
first thing is
sorry. No, you're right.
Shall I go?
We'll just jump. Yeah, and then go to Shivani.
Sure. I mean, we know that employment is good for mental health generally, right? So, that's always a positive thing. And obviously for those people who perhaps have lost work over the pandemic, then hopefully the experience of getting back into work is going to give them a boost in terms of their mental health. But I think there are also perhaps things that we can think about in terms of how we make a kind of inclusive, socially connected workplace. And one of the things that really struck me during the pandemic was that, I work in a college which has a distributed model. We're based all over the country. I had really mainly had my social connections at work with people who I shared a campus with. Whereas now I feel I know my colleagues across the country much better. We could communicate with each other in an easier kind of way because we found virtual ways of doing that. Some of them were synchronous, some of them were asynchronous. I mean, you can definitely have too many Zoom conversations, but there were other ways of kind of keeping in touch with each other. And I think that's a really a good thing, I think, for us to be thinking about. How do we create that sense of connection between people who perhaps are not going to be spending as much time with each other face to face and get the value of that? So I think one of your speakers earlier on was talking about their kind of using their Yammer networks, and I've certainly seen those kind of things really take off in my organization, that have been able to bring people together around common interests or activities that they enjoy in a way that I certainly didn't see previously. So I think we probably need to think about how do we kind of capitalize on that, and how do we make it part of a broader sort of mental health and well-being strategy, and look at the kinds of workplace practices that support that. I mean, I certainly think on the flip side, we've got some issues around maybe needing to reestablish some of the boundaries that have sort of drifted during the pandemic. I remember having a phone conversation with a colleague at sort of midnight over something, which is something that I think I would never have done prior to the pandemic. But somehow I think that sense of kind of urgency and some of the sort of loosening, seeing people in their own context with things happening around them, kids popping up midway through a call or something, loosen some of those boundaries. And I think that's another place where perhaps employers could help people to reestablish those again.
So you feel that those boundaries are important to reestablish again? Do you feel in some sense that they have also, I guess, normalized everyone's living situation and work situations? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good point. I think in some ways, some of the for some of us, we were kind of perhaps able to see people as more fully rounded human beings. A colleague of mine, I remember one of his grandchildren, popping up in the middle of the meeting. He wanted his grandfather to play with him with something. It kind of makes people feel human, and I think allows us to see each other as first and foremost human beings, and not the titles that we wear at work, which can sometimes get in the way of that kind of human connection as well. And I also think, that kind of flexibility piece, and we've obviously heard a lot about that already today, which is so important. I think where you've got everybody working remotely and everybody's sort of lives exposed in some way all together,
then I think some of those things are less stigmatized. But if you had done that, for example, prior to the pandemic, that might have been considered to be unprofessional to have a child pop up. So I think we really need to be critical, I think, about which of those sets of behaviours we reestablish and which we decide are actually kind of good for us and we should keep them.
I think the no pants pajamas situation should definitely stay. Shivani, how was your experience throughout this, and how did you kind of manage those connections with your own team?
Yeah, it was a really good time for us to lean into our team and find out how they needed us to support them, because I think as leaders, we are generally always thinking on behalf of our people. And so as a result, we start to make decisions on behalf of our people without even realizing it, and therefore rolling it out with the very best of intent that we want to be there, we want to support them. And the very first thing that I myself and my business manager did here at The Remarkable Woman is we went, oh my God, we're actually doing that. We're actually starting to make decisions for our team as opposed to checking in with them. And so we did that. One of the things that we're doing here at The Remarkable Woman is we're going back to the office next in 2022. And so, Emma and I had a chat about what that could look like. And we had a discussion with the team, and we realized that really wasn't going to work for the team. And so we actually just threw that right out the window and said, what works for you? This has been a really tough year and things have changed. And Kathryn, as you pointed out, barriers have been blurred, and that's been a good thing and a bad thing, right? Yeah. And so, because sometimes barriers are really good for mental health. Sometimes it's really good to be able to just shut the door and be like, I need to work right now. I need to be focused because it gives me a sense of productivity and progress. And other times I need to be flexible. And so we went to our team, and the answer that came out was, we so desperately want to get back to the office, but actually we don't want to get back to the office full time. We want to get back to the office and still have some of the wonderful new norms that have crept in, that have embraced and celebrated my whole self, that I'm this whole human, that I'm a working woman and a mum, and I'm someone who likes to keep fit, and I'm someone who likes to have a bit of a social life, and I'm, and so on and so forth. And so the answer that we got is 3 days in the office is going to be the perfect balance, because the other 2 days a week, people can go to the gym, maybe even have a social coffee and still start work on time. And that was the right answer. On the other end as well, there's this huge element of meeting fatigue, and Zoom fatigue and all that sort of stuff. But just, because everyone is working remotely, everyone's having these meetings for the sake of meetings. And so, again, we leaned in and figured out, well, how can we empower people? Just because things are remote, just because it's really easy to Slack someone or Teams someone or anything, does that mean that you still have to? How are we still creating safe spaces for people to do deep work without getting pings every 5 seconds and just being rattle-brained constantly? So my short answer to your question is, Tarla, the answers lie with your people, and ask them what they need, and start to create barriers around that to have more success in those areas.
I think that's such a good point. We often talk about how the positives and the benefits of remote work and flexible work, but so many employers, even throughout this period, are not getting it entirely right. The balance isn't there, because there is that expectation on people to still be able to meet every obligation of their work in the same way that they were able to prior to the pandemic, even though, and not taking into account all of the other competing priorities that are kind of taking place there. So I think that need to check in with your team and to talk to them and really assess what's going on and what is needed there is such a critical point.
And it's increased. It's increased, Tarla. It's increased now, that need to check in on a human level. How are you going? How is the family? How are you feeling about everything in the jungle? Because previously when we go to our workplaces, we weren't just our productive office worker, as well as the cleaner, as well as the carer, as well as the teacher. We weren't all of these things, right? We were just me going into the office, and now we are all of these things, and that impacts our ability to work. So as leaders, we need to check in on the whole self as opposed to just the work self.
Yeah, So I would actually say, so, I mean, Kathryn, would you agree with that employers need to do some considerable work there to really establish practices and those habits of checking in and having those conversations with their teams to make
Yes,
sure that
absolutely.
Yeah,
I completely agree, Tarla. I think, for us in the education sector, we kind of took all of our teaching online overnight, but businesses really, went to remote working overnight. And that's not usually a good way of actually delivering something in the best format it can possibly be. So I guess now is our opportunity to really kind of pull back from that a little bit and think, and I love what Shivani was saying about, kind of checking in with people about what's the best balance and what's the best kind of structure within which we can do this. So to be able to kind of, I guess, kind of settle a little bit after all of the sort of red light emergency kind of experience that we've had, and think it through, think about it as a strategy. What does it look like? How does it work best? What are some of the other things that go with it? Because I think, it wasn't just that suddenly we were working remotely. We were also, I can recall in the early days of the pandemic, literally having the radio on the whole time, listening to the news. How many more cases were there? How many more cases? There was a lot else happening at that time. So just kind of really needing to get back to thinking about what's the best way of embedding that opportunity to work remotely with other aspects of flexibility, which might be about the times that you work at as well. I've got staff, I have a teenage daughter myself, but I've also got staff with younger kids who, they want to be able to go and pick up their kids from school. So can we leave a gap for, kind of school pickup time when it comes to meetings? So those kinds of things that I think we just kind of need to think about in a more strategic fashion.
And we probably need to think about the way that we normalize that for men as well, because, flexibility is often this kind of topic that's discussed around women and how women, get onto the right footing in their career. But really, I think for flexible work to be to work properly, it needs to be ubiquitous, and it needs to be taken up by men, and it needs to be encouraged by employers to be taken up by everyone.
And it goes with all of those other things as well. Like, do people have access to the kind of environments where they can work productively and safely, from home? Do they have, a reasonable internet connection, for example, or the right kind of services, or the right software or hardware? All of those sorts of things we kind of need to think about all together. And if we don't, I think we inadvertently actually disadvantage people, and that can be cumulative as well with other identities or intersectionalities that people may have. Yeah.
Shivani, you do a lot of work around connections and supporting women through mentoring with the Remarkable Woman. How important are those connections for career progress and morale, and for leadership trajectory as well?
It's so important, right? I mean, we all hear about this 10,000 hour rule, or some of us may have heard of it. And for those who haven't, it's essentially, if you want to get really, really good at something, then it's all about the repetition and the hours that you put into something, right? So if you do it generally for 10,000 hours, you can become this, world-class leading expert at it. But that concept is actually incredibly flawed, Tarla, because if you did the same thing over and over again without anyone checking in and giving you pivots and balance and saying, actually, that worked really well, but did you see that when you said this thing, the reaction came across in this way? You need to constantly be given feedback from someone you know and respect, and someone who's done this before you, so that you can pivot and tweak and get better and better at it, rather than the definition of insanity and doing it, doing the same thing over and over again. And so it's just that, right? If you're working if you're working alone without those human connections, you genuinely aren't getting an opportunity to get better at your craft. You're not getting any feedback, let alone those beautiful, sunshine moments of feedback when you get where someone says, hey, Tarla, that was so awesome. I love the way that you host that. And you get this beautiful lift of emotion, right? You're not getting that. You're not getting any of the improvement feedback either. And so that will really stagnate your growth, but also stagnate your morale, because you don't have any clarity on how things are working for you. So that mentoring, those connections are absolutely vital, to how it is that you progress. I mean, but I'm also seeing it in my hiring practices, Tarla, where we've been recruiting recently, and we actually noticed that when we recruit people who've been effectively contracting on their own and not working as part of a larger team or having a mentor or having a leader, those people are actually far more behind in their level of skill set, but also in their level of confidence and recognition of their own self-worth, as others who worked in robust teams, had really strong leaders and had mentors. And then there's the stats around this. If you had a mentor, if you have a mentor, you're 5 times more likely to get promoted. Why? Because you've got someone actually guiding and supporting you and giving you advice along the way. So it's absolutely crucial, not just for how you feel, but your career trajectory.
Yeah. Kathryn, is there anything you'd add on to that?
I guess just, humans are social animals, and we learn by observation. So, having access to somebody who where you can observe how they're dealing with particular things, and you can reflect on how you might address that yourself as well. I mean, that's kind of crucial too. So, and shouldn't be under-recognized. And I guess some of us have those opportunities informally. We just, they happen to be available to us. And I think that's where that kind of remote working potentially becomes an issue too, that there's less opportunity for the kind of accidental or incidental exposure to these things. So we might need to think about actually how to make sure that we build them in, and mentoring is obviously a beautiful way of doing that.
And just on, the importance of mentors and sponsors, like I think it's probably fair to say that over the last 2 years, it's been quite difficult for a lot of women to establish or nurture those kind of relationships. But even as we move on, it may be challenging, especially if we're working in this kind of more remote kind of framework. How important is it to find those relationships? And are there some tips around, that both of you could offer around kind of how to find them in this new phase of how we're working? Shivani, I might go to you first.
Yeah, sure. Look, I can't help but do a shameless plug if that's what you're asking. That's
Please, always.
If you're looking for a tip on how you can connect with a community of women, or connect with mentors, that is essentially what we do. And I absolutely invite any woman who wants to connect with another like-minded woman, or connect with a mentor based on where they're at with their career and talk about their goals and their challenges. We can certainly pair them up with incredible mentors and support them. And outside of that, it is essentially doing more of what I've just said. So looking for communities of like-minded women so that you feel included, because a sense of belonging, and Kathryn, I'm sure you've got so much to share on this, right? A sense of belonging is so important to us, and knowing that we fit with a tribe, that people get us. But also from there, having this stretch of, this, I'm capable of something more. Here is where I am, but here is where I want to be. And being able to stretch ourselves and surround ourselves with people who are doing that kind of thing, that network effect will have an incredible outcome on your trajectory. If you just surround yourself with people who are doing the kind of work that you want to do, just spend enough time with them, and I promise you magic will happen for you, because you will see what they're doing and you'll go, well, that's a great idea. I should be doing something similar. I should be pushing myself in similar ways. I should be connecting myself to similar people, opportunities or challenges, so that I too can achieve that. And it's for that reason that you should go out and seek those communities, seek those mentors, so that you can put yourself outside of your comfort zone, because that is where the growth happens. That is where the magic happens. So, one of the good things and bad things about working in an isolated fashion is that we are kind of pretty comfortable, right? I mean, we can turn up to a Zoom meeting with, and Tarla, you called it, right? Let's not turn up to Zoom meeting with pajama bottoms on the bottom and just I'm very, very happy to admit that I'm wearing my work skirt under this.
Oh, good work.
PJs, because it makes me feel like I'm getting dressed and ready for work and in that zone, right? Because getting slightly outside of your comfort zone pushes you to be at your best. And so you've got to do things like that whilst we're in this comfort of working from home, so that you are pushed a little bit further.
Yeah.
And I think some careers make it easier than others. I mean, for example, I originally trained as a clinical psychologist, and a lot of the way that you learn in that kind of environment is through working with a supervisor. And so effectively, when I finished my training, I had, 5 or 6 different people that I'd worked with over time, who many of those relationships were maintained over time, and that's certainly true of the psychology students that I've supervised over the years as well. So there's sort of already a model for that, if you like, and something you can kind of something that you can use to leverage those opportunities. I think the other thing that's really struck me over time is not realizing when you are actually somebody else's mentor. Sometimes it kind of sneaks up on you. It's a kind of an informal thing. And you kind of, actually that's what this relationship is. I can kind of see that now. Or, so I think making that part of the culture of the organization, I think, can be a really valuable thing. So encouraging people to invest time, if they see somebody who they think they can offer something to, or if you see someone, like Shivani was saying, ahead on the journey, who's somewhere doing something that you want to do, then, reach out to them. I think if we can create that sense of kind of generosity in an organization where people can see that, I know I've benefited from mentors over the year, both formally and informally. And I want to pass that on now. And I want to encourage all of my colleagues to do the same.
And there are probably different ways that employers need to think about the ways that they connect, more senior members of their team with junior members and establish those relationships now that we are kind of moving into this kind of hybrid work circumstance as well, because it probably isn't as easy as what it used to be, or at least, it will be different. So I think
certainly
that some of those are the things that employers need to start thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about personal relationships as well, which I think have taken probably a little bit of a hit throughout this period for a lot of us. And, I think as we're trying to juggle so much, we've let other relationships, be it with family members or partners or whatnot, fall off a little bit. But how do we prioritize personal relationships in amid the chaos of everything else? Shivani.
So the first thing that my husband and I did, and this was a 2020 thing that we still do now, because we're seeing so much of each other now. We're both working from home, constantly, and there's these little bugbears that you have with each other in the household that just go times 50 when you're both working and living in the same space. And there was this meme that popped up on the internet, and it was, call your partners, from another department and talk about them from that way. And so I used to say to my husband, Ash, gee, it's really annoying that Tom from marketing keeps putting the milk out. I wish Tom from marketing could just put the milk back. And he knows I'm talking about him, right? It's like, I know that Tom, oh man, I mean, he just needs to get, he just needs to get back together. And it was just a really fun way to talk about the annoying things that the both of us were doing, because he calls me Hurricane Shivani, because apparently I'm just as much of a mess in the kitchen, and I just, blow up the kitchen, make my lunch, and then run back downstairs to work. So I think bringing humor into your relationship and finding ways to talk about each other and those annoying things that you do is really important. And then just coming back to boundaries, right? All these boundaries are so blurred. Both of us could be working, till 7, 8, 10, 11 o'clock at night without blinking an eyelid. We're both self-employed. We're both super supportive of each other. But that also means that we're both super supportive of accidentally unwinding personal time together. And so you've got to have rocks in your diary for each other, non-negotiables. And that works really well for us. So, on a Wednesday afternoon, I don't care what is happening in the world, 6 o'clock or 4 o'clock, whatever works for you and your family. That's a hard deadline. I'm off. And we set expectations with our team on that as well, and say, I will not be doing anything unless something blows up. I will be off, and this is my time with my family. And so just creating barriers around that, creating space around that actually makes life easier for you as well, because it takes away some of that guilt and that resentment. There's a fine line that sits between the two of them. You work too much, you're going to start resenting work. You work, but also if you spend too much time away from your partner, you're going to start to feel really guilty, and that has other ramifications, or your family as well. So I think having those discussions and bringing a little bit of humor into things as well, and just knowing which one to spend more time in when, by having little check-ins every now and then, tend to work for us.
I do love the Tom from marketing advice there. I'm definitely going to start using that one.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's something my partner will definitely appreciate. He may find it slightly passive aggressive, but we'll work with it.
There are worse ways to be passive aggressive than saying Tom from marketing.
It's very good. It's very good. Kathryn, anything you'd add on to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues really is that we were all in a very unusual situation, and we had to be super flexible for a period of time. And so I think it's really important, as Shivani was saying, to try and kind of set the tone from the top and encourage our leaders to reestablish some of those things so that people don't feel like they're letting the side down if they are clocking off at the time they're supposed to be clocking off at, to spend time with their families and their loved ones. The other thing I guess I'd say in relation to that is that also it again might be that actually the standard office hours are not necessarily going to fit well with some people's needs. So where we can be flexible about that so that people can work in different patterns, as long as obviously it meets the needs of the organization that they're working for as well, and you've kind of got that balance, that nice balance going, then I think thinking about that as well can be incredibly helpful to give people the time that they need at the times that they actually need it, so especially if you've got small children and they're feral after whatever time o'clock at night, it's no good to you if you're going to be available late in the evening. You really need to be able to take the time at some other point.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to go to one last question. I could speak to both of you all day long, but I want to talk about, this notion of the future of work, which we've touched on a little bit within this, and whether or not, despite the virtues of moving to a more virtual, flexible mode of working, whether that in turn lends itself to being less empathetic, because we are going to be around each other less. And, obviously things can get lost in translation through virtual mediums and through email and whatnot. How do we stop ourselves from becoming a less empathetic workforce? Kathryn, I might go to you first.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that this is a really important one. I certainly think that not everybody started with a level playing field when it came to the kind of skills that you need to relate with people in kind of virtual environments. And obviously those environments that can be very different to each other as well. So, email is an asynchronous form of communication. You can write yours, but you can also stop and think about what you're writing and think about expressing it carefully. Whereas if you're talking to somebody on a video call, it's obviously a live interaction, even though you're remote. And so I think you need slightly different skills in different situations. Certainly in this kind of situation, there are fewer kind of non-verbal cues to rely on. So just thinking about how else you can replace that with cues that help people to feel like you understand them. So, the classic paying attention when you're on these calls, looking directly at the camera rather than looking at the screen to the side, not trying to reply to your emails at the same time, something I know I occasionally fall into the trap of doing, positioning yourself so that people can see you clearly, and perhaps needing to use more verbal ways of communicating empathy and that you're listening to somebody. So paraphrasing what they've said rather than, just nodding. I suppose the other thing is that it's really because you're kind of not in a position where you can necessarily, you can't necessarily catch somebody's eye in the same way. So, kind of maybe having some rules around how you communicate in a space like this, if you want to ask a question or if you want to raise something. So there are probably some new kind of niceties that we need to learn so that those interactions, we're not cutting each other off, but we're also making sure that people who perhaps don't feel as confident to speak up are being welcomed and invited into the conversation.
And Shivani, any final thoughts on that one as well?
Yeah, that point, Kathryn, that you made around just catching someone's eye, I think is a really big one, because, you know, I was actually talking to a colleague, and I was asking him, you know, how are you going with your team? He's got a team of 20, you know, all working from home. And he said, you know, Shivani, it's really tough because I often used to walk, you know, through the office, and I would catch someone's eye and I could see that they were struggling, and I would check back in and say, how are you doing? Can I help? And it's those micro mentoring moments that people are really missing out on. And so when we all work from home, there's this pressure of I'm alone and I need to figure this out on my own. And so to your point, Tarla, of how can we be a more empathetic workplace and more empathetic leaders is we've really got to check in with people, and offer that time, and keep, you know, and keep communicating that we are here. And you know, there is no question that is too small or too silly, and we are here to support you. You're not on your own. But also on the other end as well, we're always, because we're working from home, we're always available. And so the empathy or the level of understanding that ends up happening around that tends to decrease. So I think it's really important, again, for leaders and teams, but leaders to set that culture that if I can see that you are working, you know, past a certain time, one, to acknowledge that, and not just be like, oh, you know, thanks for doing that, great job, Tarla, and, you know, really appreciate those extra hours, but acknowledge it, and ask what that took for you, what that took away from you and your family, and how can I give that back to you? You know, are we going to do some time in lieu? Are we going to give you extra annual leave so that you don't feel as though you're completely burning out? I'm hearing of people who are taking their laptops into their bathroom because they simply cannot miss a notification. They're on call, on demand all the time. And so by ignoring that, by not acknowledging that, we are being less empathetic, and we need to tune into that and create that space for people, and let them know that it is okay to unplug, and using technology to be able to do that as well. Putting your snooze notifications on, I think, is a really good way to be able to do that, to carve out some space for yourself. And how do you do that as a workplace? Leaders have got to do it too. So, you know, so a really good thing is, you know, having a solid hour per day, no meetings that happen. Everyone gets that hour to, if they want to, you know, just have lunch on their own, do yoga, or just do quiet work, whatever it is, you know, for them, you know, as well as showing that I hear you and I'm doing the actions that are needed to hear you and to understand you.
I want to thank you both so much for joining us on this session today, and sharing your expertise on this issue. I think so much of what we've talked about is so important, and I think that there are so many benefits to this new way of working that we're moving into, which you've both noted, but it's just about how we recalibrate and get back to a place where we are incorporating all aspects, and being really mindful of everyone's life and career circumstances. Just really, I think the point that you made, Kathryn, around just rebooting a little bit now. We've let the dust settle. We're at a different point now, and even though we are likely to move into a different form of work, even post pandemic, we just need to make sure that it's an inclusive frame of work. So thank you both so much for joining me on this session.
Thank you.